listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this episode, I speak to bioethicist Dr. Sarah Chan.
What is enhancement and what means do we have holistically, not just new technologies, but old technologies, not just technologies of genetic engineering, but, also changing society, changing the way we think about ourselves and our relation to others. All of these can be enhancing in the sense that they can give us the opportunity to live better and more flourishing lives.
Sarah shared her thoughts on the ethics of human genome editing, the potential of developing a social model of enhancement, and the possibility of using biotechnology to improve the cognitive abilities of animals. I first met today's guest, Dr. Sarah Chan, at Greenbelt Festival in 2013 when I spoke alongside her and Professor Steve Fuller on a panel exploring the possibilities of human enhancement. I remember being profoundly jealous of the sorts of things that she got to explore as part of her day job as a bioethicist. From new forms of genetic therapies for profoundly modifying the body, to the possibility of developing human-animal hybrids, otherwise known as chimeras, to using the latest technology to uplift animals to human levels of intelligence. Super chimps, she called them. Although she's often exploring the moral issues that arise at the boundaries where species meet, what has always been core to her work is a deep interest in maximizing human flourishing. It's why I was so excited to hear about her latest idea, the concept of the social model of enhancement. This form of relational transhumanism not only looks at the body as a site for deploying new technologies, but encourages us to think about the ways we have already engineered society and culture, and then dares us to ask what might be worth revisiting or even redesigning. So it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce you to the always insightful superhuman that is Dr. Sarah Chan. Sarah, your work is focused on the field of bioethics, which is fast becoming one of the 21st century's most pressing concerns. And your job, it requires you to think about everything from far future possibilities such as human cloning, all the way through to animal-human hybrids and genetic engineering. But let's start at the beginning. What is bioethics and why does it matter so much?
So the question of how we should live in the world, what is good to do, what is right to do, what is bad or wrong that we shouldn't do, is as old as humanity itself. But in the 21st century, the pace at which new technologies are emerging, changing our abilities to intervene on the world around us, to affect the lives of other humans, and even to change our own lives, our own bodies, and our own futures, I think is something that is challenging us in unprecedented ways. So bioethics, if you like, is the study of how we should live with biotechnology. It takes that age-old question of what is a good life, what ought we to do, and it poses that question in relation to technologies such as genome editing, which give us the ability to change biology, change the environment, in connection with technologies such as cybernetics that question the boundaries between humans and machines, artificial intelligence. So in relation to all of these, the questions about what it is to be human and what it is to be a good life require us to think very carefully about these sorts of issues.
Now, one of the ways you utilize bioethics is in thinking about something called human enhancement. So what is the relationship between bioethics and this idea of enhancing the human being?
If you think about the word enhancement itself, it means to make something better, doesn't it? And actually, if you look at most of human biomedicine, what we're trying to do is to make people better, to make sick people better, to give people better health. But what happens when our focus shifts from not just curing disease, curing sickness, but taking healthy humans and improving their abilities in some ways, making them, if you like, in Carl Elliott's words, better than well. So the concept of human enhancement then has grown out of the push within biomedicine to make humans better. And it poses the question to us, is it possible, is it desirable to make better humans? And what would that mean?
Well, can we make the argument that something like human enhancement could actually be morally agreeable? A lot of people, when they hear the idea of enhancing human beings, they think, well, that's artificial. That's not natural. And the distinction between the artificial and natural is central to this idea of human enhancement, isn't it?
One of the arguments that's often raised against human enhancement is, if you like, this fear of technology, fear of doing something that's against nature. And if we think about that for a moment, actually, almost everything we do with modern medicine is against nature. It's natural to have your teeth fall out. It's natural to die as the result of infection. So if you like, the argument that, oh, but it's not natural, when we think about it for a moment, we can see that that's not really a good argument against human enhancement. I suppose another question that enhancement raises is whether we ought to be trying to transcend natural limits. So, humans live to 75, 85 years old. We can, if we're very fast, we can run a mile in 4 minutes. We're able to do certain things and we're not able to do other things. And we might say, well, is there something, Michael Sandel might call it hubristic, if you like, about trying to transcend the limitations that nature has imposed on us. But again, if we think about that, I say the human lifespan is 75, 85 years. Roll back 200 years and you were lucky if you made it to 75. And all of that has come about as the result of things like improvements in our understanding of human biology, improvements in healthcare, public health. So, in fact, the enhancement project, if you like, the idea of trying to make human lives better is only the next step in a trajectory that really, ever since we became aware of ourselves and aware of our power to shape the environment, going right back to things like making tools, making fire, agriculture, human activity has been the pursuit of how to make human lives better, how to make the world a better place for us and those around us. So using the kinds of technologies that we have today in pursuit of so-called human enhancement is just the next step along that path.
So in other words, Sarah, would you say that it's actually natural for human beings to want to shape both their environment and their biology according to their desires?
Human beings have been called the tool-using animal. I think it probably is natural for us to try to modify ourselves, to try to shape the environment. But I also want to say that that isn't the determinant of what's moral or what's not. Things that occur in nature, be it a bountiful harvest or a freak thunderstorm that destroys half the village, these things don't have any innate morality to them. So, for us to say, well, it's natural for humans to want to change ourselves, doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's bad. It's natural for humans to have a suspicion and a distrust and a negative attitude towards those who are not from our tribe, in-group versus out-group bias. Does that mean that it's moral for us to treat strangers with prejudice and hatred? Well, no, it doesn't. So actually what's natural and what's moral don't have any given relationship to each other.
So why do you think that this idea of something being natural is almost automatically in culture assumed to be better?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure it's one that I'm entirely qualified to answer, because that's psychological and sociological, isn't it? Why do we prefer certain things? I suppose part of the preference for the natural maybe comes from a little bit of what Nick Bostrom and Toby Ord have called status quo bias. We like things to be the way they are, or at least with things the way they are predictable. Once we step in to change things, once we intervene in the natural order, there's always an element of uncertainty. There's what might happen? And I suppose together with that comes an element of moral responsibility. So if I step in to change the natural order and something goes wrong, I'm somehow responsible. If the natural order is, not that great, but I don't do anything, maybe that's not my fault. It's the way that nature made it. Now, I think there's actually a moral fallacy there in saying that we're not responsible for the things we merely allow to happen versus the things we cause to come about. If I see a banana skin that's fallen naturally from a banana tree and you're about to slip on it, and I could have picked it up, just because it got there naturally and it is my failure to act rather than my action in throwing it on the ground. If I can see that a harm is going to happen because I've failed to do something to intervene in the natural order, I think I'm still responsible for that. And I think, most of us would agree. But maybe there's a sort of bias there about, well, if we don't do anything, it's not our fault.
Well, there is that idea of unintended consequences and so much uncertainty when it comes to these sorts of ideas. The actions that we take today, we don't know the effects that they potentially have in the future. And to what extent do you feel that a discussion of bioethics needs to take into account things like future generations and how our decision-making today will actually have impact on them?
So the question of how do we ethically account for the future is a complex one. I think particularly in relation to people who might or might not exist. Once we know that people will exist, then I think we do have an obligation to try to secure the future for them, to make sure that the world that we leave to them is not, degraded to the point that it's incompatible with a good human life of flourishing. Does that mean we are obliged to bring people into existence to witness that future world? Well, no, it doesn't. So, for example, every day, every month that you decide that you're not going to have children, that you're not going to try to conceive a child, or that you're not going to have IVF, that means someone won't exist in the future. Do you have any obligation to that potential future person to bring them into life? No. But once you are going to, once you've taken a decision to say, well, yeah, let's bring a child into the world, I think you do have obligations with respect to that person, even if you don't know who they are yet, even if they don't yet fully exist as a realized person. So I suppose in terms of our obligations to future generations, if we think that future generations of humans will exist, if we want future generations of humans to exist, and I think most of us probably do, I think we think a world with humans in maybe has a certain richness in it that would otherwise be lacking, then we do have obligations to try to secure the future for those people, whoever they may be.
Well, part of the reason I asked that question is because one of the most contentious forms of enhancement is genetic enhancement, genetically modifying humans, because of the fear that the sorts of changes that we make today may end up causing germline changes further down in different generations. Why do you think something like human genome editing became so contentious?
So undeniably, the prospect of heritable genome editing and the possibility of affecting future generations is something that raises concern. And it's partly because I suppose there's the sort of precautionary idea that if we mess something up for one generation, that would be bad. But if we mess something up for every future generation, then, that would be much worse. So there's what I call an escalator effect, I suppose, that any adverse effects that if they don't just affect one generation, but they affect all future human generations, will be magnified. The negative effects of that will be magnified. I'm going to come back to that escalator effect argument and examine it a little more closely. But I think that it's worth unpacking and acknowledging perhaps also that there's a real cultural significance. There's a sort of cultural resonance, if you like, around genetics and the genome. So since the point where we started to understand DNA as the stuff of life, the way that we've talked about genetics and the genome, the book of life, the common heritage of humanity, the Human Genome Project and the politicization of the science. This was, if you like, reading the human book of life for the first time, but it was also framed and discussed as a sort of joint initiative that brought the human race together to understand who we were. If you look at all of the discourse around how the Genome Project was mobilized as this kind of initiative of representing all of humanity working together to understand something about ourselves. So I think it's It's not surprising that genetics and the genome have assumed this sort of political significance. And so, as Maloney writes in his book on political biology, the genome's not just a biological object anymore, it is political. And therefore, proposing to intervene on the genome is, if you like, meddling with the sort of basic stuff of human society. How do we organize ourselves? How do we understand ourselves as a collective? How do we value people within society? It implicates all of those questions. So I think that's really important to acknowledge.
Well, as a bioethicist, do you think that we should genetically modify humans?
That's a very broad question. I'm not going to say, yes, we should genetically modify humans, or no, we shouldn't. I will say that I don't think there is any in principle reason that we should not modify the human genome. And I will say that at every level, from we already modify the human genome in vitro, in cell culture for our research. We are starting to modify the human genome in what we might call somatic gene therapies, so just modify one person's genome to cure the sorts of diseases that people experience. At the Genome Editing Summit that's just happened this week in London, someone talked about gene therapy for sickle cell anemia, which is an inherited disease of the blood that causes a lot of suffering, and if it could be ameliorated, you've made someone's life better, you've treated their disease. But I would also say there's no in principle reason why we should not modify the human genome in a heritable way, but there are lots of in practice reasons why we perhaps shouldn't be doing that just yet.
Well, you mentioned there this idea of taking a precautionary approach to these sorts of technologies, but is there a good moral argument, I guess, for taking a proactionary approach? When we talk about things like genetically modifying humans, we assume it's the entirety of the human race. But if we have these sort of small cases here and there, maybe in different nations or in different research groups, whereby they're doing different experiments that are, I don't want to say ethically dubious, but maybe pushing the boundaries of what's possible, isn't there something we could learn as a human species if we allow for a proactionary approach which is less risk adverse?
Yeah, so in juxtaposing these two terms, precautionary and proactionary, so let's just take a step back and unpack what we might mean by those. The precautionary principle, if you look at its origins in environmental science and environmental ethics, its origins, if you like, were in a sense proactionary. So the precautionary principle in environmental science was, when you think that by taking a certain action you might be able to prevent greater damage, the fact that there might not be evidence to show this shouldn't be a reason not to step in and try to stop the damage that you think might occur. So the precautionary principle in its original sorts of applications to technology and how to use it is far less conservative than we might understand it. But then it's become caricatured in a way to, just in case something happens, we shouldn't do anything. And that wasn't the way that it was originally ethically formulated, interestingly. Nevertheless, I think something might happen, we never know what, and that something might affect all future human generations. That's a pretty scary prospect, and I think that is partly what is behind some of the we should not be conducting heritable genetic modification. I think that, well, we don't know what might happen, and it might affect all generations in the future. We might wipe out the human race. I think that is partly what's behind that thinking. Now, let's look at that argument in practical terms, if you like. So you said we're not talking about changes that are going to immediately affect the entire human race. And I think that's absolutely true. So point number one is, if we start making these heritable changes, it's not as if we're going to start that and tomorrow this change will have spread through the entire human race with no possibility of rolling it back. So we're talking about things that at the start are going to happen on a small scale with a small number of individuals. The next point is that even if something goes wrong, and I do think safety is one of the big issues that we have around genome editing at the moment, but even if something goes wrong and we have so-called off-target effects, or if we have unexpected side effects from an intended modification, from an on-target effect, we would still have the choice of, in the next generation, are those passed on or not? So a child who's born with a genetic modification that perhaps doesn't have the desired effect or that has unintended side effects, we could use another round of genome editing to try to fix that, or that child would then have the choice to say, well, I don't want to pass this on. It hasn't done what it's supposed to. I don't want my children to suffer these effects. Maybe I will use something like reproductive selection. Maybe I'll adopt. There are lots of reasons why they need not pass that on to affect future generations. Now, as I've said a number of times before, that's a hard choice for someone to have to make. It's a hard choice to potentially be burdening future people with, to say, well, you either can't have children or you're going to pass on some unwanted genetic condition. But that is already the choice that people with certain genetic diseases face in the absence of genome editing or gene therapy. They already have to decide, well, do I undergo some sort of reproductive intervention? Do I risk passing this on, or do I choose not to have genetic children, maybe adopt or have gamete donation or not have children at all? So in that sense, it's not actually a worse choice than many people are already having to face.
It does come back to that age-old question of, if the technology is available to change something, then surely the ethical thing becomes to use that technology to change the outcome for better. So I guess where that debate comes up is, just as you were saying there, is mainly around the modification of embryos, which to some extent we are doing today. And yes, you can allow for certain natural paths to take their course, but if the technology is there for certain illnesses or disabilities to be removed from that embryo before the birth of the child, and the parent is made aware of it before that birth, and it's I hate to use the word fixable, but solvable solution, then surely it would be the ethical thing to use the form of enhancement. Is that what you're suggesting there?
So let me separate out two components of that argument that you've just proposed. One is the question about responsibility and action. So once we have a technology that enables us with a reasonable degree of certainty to do something, we have a choice over whether to use it or not. And abdicating the choice and going with the status quo of, well, if we don't use it, then we are letting nature take its course. I don't think we can escape moral responsibility for the outcomes of abandoning that choice. Abandoning the choice and saying, it's not my choice, so I won't use it, is a choice not to use it. And I think we need to take responsibility for that. Today we have antibiotics. If your child has a severe infection and you take them to the doctor and the doctor says, well, we recommend antibiotics, if you say, no, that's not a choice I want to make, don't give them a treatment, I abdicate the choice, you are responsible if your child then suffers or dies as a result of the infection. I think most people would say, well, a treatment's there. You are effectively choosing not to use it. So that argument about moral responsibility and action versus omission, I think, holds. The second aspect of the argument, though, and where I do want to sound a note of caution, is that we need, I think, to be careful about what we class as disease. So, I think most people would say a rampaging bacterial infection is something that's not good for anyone under almost any circumstances. Where we get into a more complex discussion with genetics and genetic diseases is that there are plenty of, there are lots of things that genetics affect, and not all of them are necessarily disease. So, when we're talking about, I don't know, perhaps height, height is partly genetically determined as well as environmentally through nutrition, and some genes will make you taller and some genes will make you shorter. How genetically short do you have to be before we decide that actually that's a disease that we would be irresponsible not to treat? Do you have to be so short that you can't reach the top shelves in your kitchen? I can't reach the top shelves in my kitchen. Do you have to be so short that perhaps you can't be a star basketball player? Well, again, most of us aren't that tall. So I think because genetics affects so many things and not just conditions that are clearly disease, if there is indeed such a thing, I think we need to be careful about saying, well, if we could do something, we should do something, and think more carefully about what are the conditions that we're saying people should do something about, and what does that mean about our ideas of how humans should be in the world. How should human bodies be and look? How should humans behave? What should they do? How should they experience the world? So, I just want to sound a bit of a note of caution there.
Some of the things that you're talking about there, especially when it comes to height and making decisions about how high or how tall or how short that you might want to be, I mean, these sorts of decisions, they're based less on how do you live a good life and more on social circumstances, the way in which society values perhaps things like height. So how do we think about enhancement in that context, I guess, as something that is guided by the sort of worlds, the cultures, the societies that we've created?
So height's a really interesting one in terms, I guess, particularly of social norms. So James Hughes has famously pointed out a few times that I think in the US, for every extra inch of a man's height, his salary goes up $10,000 a year or some such. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily as an individual man, but across population groups. The taller you are, the more money on average you make. And that's not because basketball players are paid more than chimney sweeps, although they probably are. There's definitely an association between height and social power and status and desirability and all of these sorts of strange things. But we can look at it another way, and I think this really illustrates that one person's enhancement might be another person's disadvantage. If you want to be a star basketball player, every extra inch is probably an advantage to you. But if you want, say, to be a jockey or a gymnast, you don't want to be too tall. So is it an enhancement? Well, it depends on your life project, what you want to do in life. Height is definitely one of those things that has both a sort of socially created value that we should look at and critically question, but that also, depending on what you want to do with your life and with your body, might be either an advantage or a disadvantage.
So, Sarah, are you saying that in some cases we almost think about engineering our biology or engineering our bodies based on the ways in which we've engineered society, our environment, and even our social norms?
So we could do that. We could see a technobiological solution as the way to make ourselves conform with the norms that are out there, as a way to achieve what we want within the constraints of the social. But I think it's also important to look at those constraints of the social and say, well, hang on, we could change our bodies, but what if we changed the rules? What if we changed the social norms that said we have to be and look a certain way? And so this is getting into what I've called before the social model of enhancement. So some of you may be familiar with the social model of disability that says disability is produced not only by someone's physical capacities and limitations, the inability to climb steps, for example, but also by the social conditions around that. If buildings have ramps instead of steps, someone who's physically unable to climb steps isn't disabled with respect to getting into that building. So understanding that what we're able to do in the world, what enables us to live the lives we want or to do the things we want to do, is both a product of our individual capacities, but also the limitations society imposes on us, can be looked at from the point of view of enhancement as well as disability. So, I said being short is a disadvantage if you want to play basketball, but it's an enhancement if you want to be a gymnast. In the same sort of way, things that we think of as enhancements to our physical body, often conditioned by the social circumstances in which those bodies operate. And so I think it's important as well as to say, well, what can we do with technology to change our bodies, be it cybernetics or genetics or whatever else? Yes, what can we do with technology to change our bodies? But what can we do to change society to allow our bodies to function in ways that help us to flourish within social constraints? How can we change society's limitations?
We almost take society as this kind of operating system that's unchangeable, and it does feel often when you read about the sorts of human enhancements that might be possible in the future that they're all very driven around what we value, I guess, in modern society, and usually that's around things like productivity. A lot of the driving force behind things like Neuralink are how do we enhance human brains to be competitive in the job market with things like AI. So I guess what you're saying there is if we take this idea of the Anthropocene seriously, then we shouldn't just be focusing on engineering our body and biology, but we should also be focused on engineering our environment and our social circumstances.
Yes, absolutely. So if we take the position that societal norms are a given and bodies are changeable, we're always going, if you like, to be chasing an unattainable goal. Whereas I think we should say, well, bodies are changeable, but so is society. So one of the examples that I like to use to illustrate this in relation to enhancement is cognitive enhancement and caffeine. Now, the classical enhancement argument around using drugs like Ritalin or modafinil to promote concentration and alertness and help us stay awake longer to increase, as you say, our productivity. The sort of classical argument is, why wouldn't they be acceptable? I mean, we all drink coffee. Everyone drinks coffee. It's become a joke. You need your coffee in the morning to function. And what we're not asking when we make that argument is, why does everyone need to drink so much coffee in the first place? Why do we have a society that requires us to be awake and alert at all sorts of hours? Why are we subscribing those social constraints that say, well, you've got to get up at a time you wouldn't normally get up and be awake and alert for far more hours than you should be awake and alert. So here, have some caffeine or have some modafinil. How can we change those social norms?
Do you think then that when we're thinking about the sorts of possibilities for the way in which we want to live as human beings in the world, we need to look at maybe our innate superpowers and think about how to enhance those? So, for example, a lot of people are turning to things like meditation to deal with the negative impact of modern life. This fact that information is coming at you all the time and work requires you to be on 24/7 almost. They're turning to tools and technologies, ancient tools and technologies that allow them to have a different relationship with the world and in many cases give them the sorts of human flourishing and human enhancement they desire. It doesn't require a pill, it just requires the ability to learn how to breathe.
Yeah, I would say we risk hyper-focusing on new technologies as the solution to the problems of the modern world. I don't want to valorize, going back to our discussion about the natural or the ancient, I don't want to say that just because things are ancient or natural, they're necessarily going to be any better. But I do think we could benefit from thinking about enhancement, not only in terms of which sort of technologies are going to be most suitable to bring about human enhancement, but saying, well, what is enhancement and what means do we have holistically, not just new technologies, but old technologies, not just technologies of genetic engineering, but, also changing society, changing the way we think about ourselves and our relation to others. All of these can be enhancing in the sense that they can give us the opportunity to live better and more flourishing lives. What about sleep? Some of us are morning people, some of us are night owls. Human beings at different stages of life need different amounts of sleep. There's a lot of research at the moment saying that actually, teenagers being famously lazy and not getting out of bed for school, actually that is due to the amount of sleep that human beings at that developmental stage need and when they need it. It is natural for teenagers to sleep in more in the mornings. I think the point that you and I are both kind of getting towards here is there's a huge diversity of abilities, capacities, preferences. We all flourish in diverse ways. And when we are forced into a mold that says there's a certain way in which human beings must operate, for most of us, that constrains our flourishing. If given the ability to work at any 8 hours during a 24-hour day, I might pick 10 till 2 and then 5 till 9. You might pick midnight until 8 a.m. Who knows? The point is allowing us to work most productively with our differences, I think can be a huge factor in enabling flourishing. And I think we are starting to see that sort of recognition. So maybe I can stop mainlining coffee in the mornings to get myself up for work.
Well, it does feel like diversity is the key word here. And a lot of the fear around human enhancement is the fact that we would apply en masse the sorts of enhancement technologies we develop. And in other words, we would eventually homogenize the human being. We would all have the sorts of similar biologies, and that would expose us. We forget it's not often survival of the fittest, it's survival of the mutant. And if we remove the mutants from the human species, with the Homo sapiens, we would remove the opportunity to survive the unexpected. So do you think that what we should optimize for when we're thinking about human enhancement technologies is allowing for a multitude of, I guess, elevators, lots and lots of different elevators, to go back to your metaphor?
Yeah, so as with so many of these questions, there are multiple aspects to the issue. And again, I want to draw out two different ones here. One is that the assumption that if everyone were given access to enhancement technologies, we would become homogeneous because everyone would want the same things, I think smacks of a certain hegemonic attitude to technology that, we must control the means of adaptation because if everyone were given access, they would all want what we have and we can't have that because it's just for us. So there's definitely a kind of ruling power class wanting to hang on to what they've got because surely everyone must want to be just like us and we can't let them because that would diminish our power. And actually, if you look at the ways in which people are seeking to use technology, yes, there are some kind of common basic human things that we all want to have enough food, we want to have shelter, we want to have freedom from pain and suffering, we want to have meaningful social relationships. But beyond that, we don't actually all want to be blonde-haired and blue-eyed. That's always the classic, isn't it? If we were all given access to genetic technologies, that's what parents would select for their children. But I really don't think that's the case. And if you look at the ways in which people are using technology to be more diverse, to embrace different bodily forms, I think that's actually, that's a self-protecting hegemonic fear that's not really going to come true. On the second aspect, which is that the more diverse we are as a species, the more likely we are as a species to survive. I think that's also true. And again, I don't think we're going to wind up with complete genetic homogeneity as a result of enhancement technologies, but we might wind up losing some variants from the population. So genetic variants that have really deleterious effects on the lives of humans who carry them. We don't know whether there might come, a catastrophic future scenario where actually what's a disease today might become a genetic advantage. There are certainly a number of genetic diseases around at the moment that have persisted in the population precisely because in certain environments they give some sort of advantage. So a couple of really well-known ones, sickle cell anemia, the condition I spoke about before that scientists are now trying to cure with gene therapy. If you are what we call heterozygous, so you have, if you like, one version of the gene that would give you the disease and one version that wouldn't give you the disease. People who have this combination of genes are more resistant to malaria. And that, as far as evolutionary human geneticists understand it, is why the prevalence of this genetic variant is higher in regions of the world such as sub-Saharan Africa, where malaria is more of a problem. So yes, there are some genetic variants that, again, it's what we spoke about, advantage in one circumstance, disadvantage in the other. Should we be worried about maintaining this variability in the population when in, let's say, in the modern environment, these variants are deleterious to the people who carry them? On whom are we going to impose the burden of suffering, of being our, if you like, our genetic arc, of carrying these variants despite the suffering they cause against the maybe one day future in which they become needed for the human race? So I think there's a sort of genetic justice question there about if we say, well, it's terrible that you have this for you, but in the future your descendants could save humanity. Well, is that really fair? And the other very obvious point to make is, look, if we can get rid of these genes or these variants that are causing a lot of suffering today, if we need them in the future, we can put them back. So if it becomes advantageous to carry this gene, we'll edit it back in.
Well, that idea of justice is so important because those are the sorts of debates that are happening today. And you mentioned the Third International Summit on Human Genome Editing, which actually occurred, I think, this week. It just occurred in London. I mean, how do you as a bioethicist, how do you work together with the sorts of folks who make the policies and the ethical principles that are related to these sorts of issues at a global level? Is it even possible to regulate for it?
So I think initiatives like the international summits have done quite well at involving scientists, ethicists, and high-level policymakers from a range of different countries and different jurisdictions. The piece that I think is still perhaps missing or incomplete is, well, either how do you get the trickle down or how do you get the bottom-up input into that? So just because the high-level scientists and high-level policymakers are all talking to each other, where are the diverse global publics in this discourse? How are their views being listened to, solicited, incorporated into our decision-making process? And, that's not something I pretend to have the answer to. But, I think we're quite good at bringing experts into dialogue with each other. But the expertise that we are still working, I think, to get into these is the expertise of diverse publics in all of the diverse fields that they operate.
Now, one of the fascinating ways you've explored some of these ideas of enhancement is not necessarily just through the idea of human enhancement, but you've also looked at the idea of enhancing animals, of this thing called uplifted animals, animal uplift. Could you just quickly explain what is animal enhancement and in what forms does it exist and what does it tell us about how we think about the enhancement project?
The concept of animal enhancement, if you like, why should we think about enhancing animals? One reason is that almost all of the technologies that we might consider using to enhance humans, genetic enhancement, pharmacological enhancement, we are going to be testing them in animals before we move on to using them on humans. And, that's just the way our research works. So if we're going to try to develop a drug that prevents heart disease or holds off heart disease for longer in humans, we're probably testing it in mice first. If we want to try and find genes that perhaps confer longevity before we try and do it on humans, we're definitely going to be trying to make mice that live to 5 years old first. And in fact, we have started to find genes that do that in animals, and we haven't yet tested them in humans. So one reason to think about animal enhancement is we are going to inevitably end up doing it en route to human enhancement. But another reason to think about it is because it prompts us, I think, to question again, what do we mean by enhancement and for whom? So you and I have already discussed the fact that one person's enhancement may be another person's de-enhancement, or that what's an enhancement in one at one time, in one environment, in one social circumstance might not be an enhancement in another. But I think with animals, the kinds of genetic changes, the kinds of technological interventions that we're performing on animals, I think really highlight this question of, well, who is it good for? Colleagues of mine at the Roslin Institute in Edinburgh have managed to use genome editing to produce pigs who are resistant to disease. Now, this is obviously good for pigs to not get sick. It's also good for farmers in multiple senses. It means that pig production is more economically effective. It means farmers don't have the sort of moral burden of having to witness disease and suffering amongst the animals they care for. So this is an enhancement for animals, but it also makes them more fit for human purposes, and it enhances the lives of the humans who work with the animals. But what about, for example, enhancing cows to give more milk? That's better for humans, more cost-effective for farmers. Is it better or is it worse for the cow? What about, for example, pedigree dogs? So if you want your dog to look cute and be small and have a pushed-in nose, that's an enhancement for human purposes. But actually, we know that dogs that have been bred for this purpose actually have, breathing and health problems because their noses are so squashed in. So who is that an enhancement for? So, this concept of enhancing animals, what are we doing to the animals and for whose benefit?
could we ever get to the point where we start thinking about enhancing animals for the animal's own interests? Is there any such thing as an animal interest? Can they have interests? And could enhancement technologies help them express those interests?
Yes, absolutely. So I think this is where animal enhancement becomes really interesting. You said, can animals have interests? And that's, I guess that's a little bit of a philosophical term to say interests, what is in something's interest. So what we're really talking about here is, can something be good or bad for an animal? When we say something is in an animal's interests, we mean it's good for them. I think it's pretty obvious to any of us who have ever had pets or who have ever been anywhere close to an animal. Of course, there can be things that are good or bad for them. We tend to think most predominantly of animals suffering pain, and that pain is bad for them, and that not suffering is good for them. And a lot of our ethical compass, I think, when it comes to animals, be it animals for food, animals used in research, even sometimes animals as pets, is about, how can we avoid pain and suffering? But if we stop to think about it, animals' lives can contain all sorts of good beyond merely the absence of suffering. So, your dog, when she looks forward to going out for a walk or eats some particularly delicious food, your cat, when they get patted in ways that they like, animals' lives can contain all sorts of good that go beyond not suffering. And I think one of the ways in which our ethical approach to animals has been a little bit limited is that so much of animal ethics around using animals for food or using them in research is just, let's make sure they don't suffer. But we haven't paid as much attention to, what's a good life for an animal and how can we help them attain that? And that's where maybe we should start thinking of animals not only as sort of tools on our way to technological progress for human enhancement, but maybe as end users and as subjects of technology in themselves, subjects who deserve to have their lives made better with the technologies that we have.
I mean, could we go as far as enhancing animals or even uplifting animals so that they may have the sorts of intelligence that approaches human level of intelligence? Is that what we're really talking about here?
Yeah, so this term uplift is an interesting one. For me, it comes partly from the science fiction writer David Brin, whose Uplift series envisions a world in which humans have made contact with alien civilizations whose level of technological sophistication and understanding of how to manipulate the world around them is as much further advanced compared to humans as humans is compared to animals. And so the aliens come along and they give us their technologies and that uplifts us. And then at the same time, humans are saying, hey, chimpanzees, you don't have the sort of level of sophistication with the technology that we enjoy. So let's enhance you cognitively and give you the sorts of abilities that humans now have. So I guess many people might say, why would you want to do that? Why would a dog or a pig or a chimpanzee want to acquire human intelligence? Now, I think there's an argument to be made here by analogy. I sometimes say to my classes, put your hands up if you would like to be smarter. And quite a lot of university students will say, yeah, I want to be smarter. Not everyone. Some people will say, no, I'm fine how I am. But then I say, put your hand up if you'd like to be made less intelligent, and nobody wants that. So most of us think subjectively for ourselves that being smarter, all other things considered, is probably going to be better for us. Whether it means, we're more easily able to remember what we need to buy at the shops and where we left our car keys, whether it means we're maybe able to have a job that's more fulfilling because we're applying our cognitive capacities. So if we think intelligence is better for humans, why would it not be better for animals? Now, admittedly, dogs and chimpanzees don't have to build suspension bridges and write complicated computer programs, although actually chimpanzees have been shown to apply principles akin to that of scientists and engineers in building their nests. But, I digress a bit there. So maybe animals don't have the same sorts of challenges in their lives that would require complex human cognition. But we can still see that, a chimpanzee who perhaps is able to build a more solid nest is maybe more socially intelligent, more able to secure their position within the social hierarchy. We can see ways in which intelligence could make animals' lives better. And so if something is good for an animal, if we have an obligation to act towards animals in fulfillment of their interests and not in frustration of them, then if being smarter is in an animal's interest, why wouldn't we have an obligation to make them smarter?
I mean, in some cases, do you think removing faculties from certain animals might be the morally right thing to do?
So this is a very difficult question, and I think it's one that also calls back to those ideas about social enhancement or social dehancement. So a particular case that has been debated by philosophers in this area, we know that chickens in an intensive farming environment suffer not only as a result of the sort of physical conditions, but if they can see too many other chickens around them, they get more stressed. Now, it's been proposed that if we were to engineer chickens to be blind, they wouldn't see other chickens around them. They would be less stressed. And actually, we know that, if you prevent them from being able to see in other ways, they are less stressed. They have better lives as intensively farmed chickens if they can't see. So is it an enhancement for those chickens to have their sight removed from them, to be genetically engineered to be blind? I think above all, this really illustrates the social dimensions of what we call enhancement, because I think most of us would say, well, for a human, our lives are better because we can see, because there are sunrises to be looked at and art to appreciate and beautiful sights. Our lives are better because we can see. But if we were chickens where seeing other chickens just stressed us out, it might be better not to be able to see. And if we feel uneasy about the idea that being made blind could be an enhancement because your living conditions are so horrible that not seeing them makes you feel better, then I think we really need to question the social environment that is causing us to farm chickens in these circumstances. The step beyond that, of course, is not just engineering blind chickens, but maybe brain-dead chickens who have no experience whatsoever and cannot be stressed and cannot suffer, cannot feel pleasure nor pain. And, is that a better life? But then I would say that no kind of biographical life at all. A brain-dead chicken is not the experiencing subject of a life. And then we may as well be growing meat in a petri dish.
Yeah. Well, it seems like there's lots of ethical and moral sorts of decisions that we need to make when it comes to looking at these issues. But one of the ways we can, I guess, prototype the future is using fiction, things like speculative imaginings and science fiction, using forms of imagination, as you mentioned with David Brin there. Sometimes they can be useful tools for exploring many of the issues that we've discussed. So how do you think new forms of, I guess, truth, how can that be reached through fiction, and how can some of these ideas be expanded on using the science fiction genre?
I absolutely think that science fiction is one of the most productive and creative ways to explore bioethical ideas. I mean, everything from we have loads of TV series and films coming out that explore the what ifs of the world. So I think Black Mirror is one that people may be familiar with. But actually going even all the way back to classic 20th century science fiction, stories that ask what if, and not just what could we do with the science, but what would it do to society? What would it do to society if, for example, as in Asimov's writings, if robots were conscious and sentient and interacting as members of society? What would it do if we had multiple genders? What would it do to society if we were able to uplift animals? And the great thing about science fiction is that it not only makes these questions accessible to different people, but it does so in different ways. So the richness of feeling a story, of imagining, is so much more, I think, than simply trying to make an abstract philosophical argument. So there's a role for both. We need the abstraction, we need to take away the context, and then when we come to the real world, we need to fill all the context back in. But when we come to science fiction, we can fill in the context in different ways. We can play in that world of what might society look like if we did this. And I think that's hugely exciting and interesting, and a really valuable role for science fiction in bioethics.
Well, do you think fiction can go as far as influencing things like public attitudes on issues around bioethics or human enhancement?
Absolutely. And that's another role, I suppose, where, I think as if you're a writer of fiction or a maker of science fiction media, I think there's a responsibility there, actually, not not to sensationalize, not to scaremonger. I think that the best sorts of science fiction invites inquiry, and the maybe less than best sort is the one that hammers you with a message about the evils of technology. I remember going to a conference about stem cell research in the early 2000s, and it was just after the film The Island had come out. I don't know if many people today will remember that, but The Island is a film about human cloning where the main plot point, sorry for spoilers, this is over 20 years old, I hope I'm not spoiling anything, but the main point is that people are being kept on an island, clones are being made and kept on an island to give organs to their rich people when their organs run out. So I went to this conference on stem cells and got in a taxi. Taxi driver said, "Where are you going?" "I'm going to a conference." "What's it about?" "Stem cell research." "Oh, is that where they clone people and kill them for their organs?" That was what the taxi driver thought stem cell research was. And I think it's probably because he'd just seen this film. And I thought, there are so many interesting questions around cloning, around stem cells and regenerative medicine, but that film didn't really explore any of them.
So we have a lot of science fiction authors on the podcast, and certainly a lot of science fiction authors who listen to the podcast. So do you think it's important then to apply these ethics ideas to the way in which fiction is written? Can science fiction be unethical? Do we need to develop ethical fiction, perhaps, Sarah?
I think, I wouldn't want to dictate to authors what they can and can't write. But I think, I guess, polemic science fiction, where the author just wants to beat you over the head with a certain idea of what's right and wrong, often isn't that great to read, not just because the beating over the head. The best science fiction I have read are the sorts of stories where there isn't an easy answer. And I hasten to add that doesn't mean there's no answer, because quite often, you'll have an ethical discussion and then at the end people will say, "Oh, but there's no right answer really." And I want to push back against that, because I think it is possible. It's often very difficult, but it is possible to say in many cases what's right and what's wrong, what we should do and what we shouldn't do. So I don't want it to devolve into, well, there's no right answer. But I think the best science fiction and the most interesting to read doesn't present you neatly with what that answer is. It invites you to reflect on it and to think about it and to reason through it for yourself. And bioethics and science fiction, that's what we're both aiming to do.
Anybody who's listening to this podcast right now who might be interested in some of the ideas that we've discussed, how can they become more involved in expanding on and exploring some of these issues and perhaps arguing and fighting for certain directions of travel when it comes to things like human enhancement? Is there ways for the general public to be involved in the hearts of these bioethical debates?
I guess one of the things you are asking there is, how do we go beyond but it's a very complex issue?
Yeah.
How do we start to get to grips with that? Because, so many of these discussions, and, often it's a way to get out of fundamental disagreement. If I'm in the pub with someone and it's just clear we're never going to agree, sometimes it's easier just to say, "Oh, but it's very complicated, isn't it?" And then we can both leave it there. But I think to seriously engage with ethical arguments, one of the prepare your mind or how to think about it steps is to realize that there are structured arguments out there, that, it doesn't have to just come down to let's agree to disagree. You can often say, well, why do we disagree? What is it we're disagreeing about? Is it, for example, fundamental values about what matters or who matters? Is it the definition of a concept? One of the most discussed issues in bioethics, abortion, right? And people will often say, well, it's about when does human life begin? And then you end up having a developmental biology debate. Well, it's not actually about that at all. It's about what kinds of lives matter morally. And so asking the right questions, making sure you're clear about your concepts, understanding which arguments fit with each other's and which are red herrings or going off on a tangent, understanding the structure of argumentation, I suppose, and how concepts and arguments fit together. There is a sort of disciplinary knowledge. There's an approach. In the same way that we have the scientific method, there is an ethical method. And once you start to unpick it, it's not just a sea of arguments and random values and concepts that we have to leave it at, well, it's a very difficult issue. We can start to make sense of it. That's the work of bioethics.
Well, I hope I've asked some of the right questions, and with that wonderful call to action, Sarah Chan, I just want to thank you for being a guest on the Futures podcast.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much, Luke.
Thank you to Sarah for showing us how to differentiate between science fiction and science fact when exploring the possibilities of human and animal enhancement. If you like what you've heard, then you can subscribe for our latest episode, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram @Futures Podcast. More episodes, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast.